Echoes of Wisdom is the latest game to use the Dark World trope, and I think it's finally perfected this trope for the series, with an inversion that incorporates unique gameplay mechanics and interesting design, which is something the others can't claim. But before I get into that, there's a moblin in the room I have to address. Does Ocarina of Time's Hyrule count as a Zelda Dark World? There's no denying it's an alternate version of the map, and it undoubtedly has the best interaction between the two timelines, but to call it a Dark World feels off to me, as outside of Castletown, the world is artistically identical, which is one of my biggest criticisms of Ocarina of Time. It wows you with this horrific opening when you walk out of a temple with an apocalyptic scene and zombies shambling in the streets, and then you walk out into the field and everything's peachy. So I'm just gonna argue that this isn't a Dark World, just time travel, and it should be put in a separate category from the rest of the series. With that caveat out of the way, let's get back to Echoes of Wisdom. The Still World is a much more intriguing use of the alternate dimension trope. Instead of just being generic shadow and evils because it's a dark and spooky place, the Still World has much more of a cosmic horror to it. Walking around the rift and seeing people frozen in place for eternity is a much more disturbing scenario than other Dark Worlds, which do undefined bad things to the creatures that get sucked in. Because you can see the effect it has on people, it's easier for you to imagine the horror of being trapped there, and for people with sleep paralysis, they can even sympathize with being stuck in a state of consciousness without being able to move. It's also more of a cosmological terror than a mystical one, which is also closer to reality as it's based more on sci-fi than fantasy. It's horrifying to ponder what happens when the universe ends, with nothing ever existing in the vast reaches of infinity. It's stated that Null and the Still World existed in the void before the goddess created the realms. We can draw a parallel to the real world with the state the universe was in before the Big Bang. Just emptiness and non-existence for an incalculable amount of time and distance. Whilst other Dark Worlds in Zelda don't have any parallels we can draw on, unless you're religious, but hopefully you can understand that I am not. And even then, the imagery that other Zeldas use is much more fantastical than biblical, so we can't really draw a parallel. Whilst the Still World riffs depict an infinity of emptiness beyond the floating remains of creation, there's just nothing below them, and what material does exist in the void is frozen in time, destined to be trapped there forever, with no life and energy flowing through it, which raises the question if these materials also count as nothing. These voids also use their temporally frozen nature as a way to incorporate unique gameplay into these sections. This is often used with their unique geometry, as most puzzles in Echoes of Wisdom are environmentally based, as the echo mechanic means that traditional puzzles are difficult to implement. This is done with structures being put on their sides and having to navigate across horizontal tree trunks and rivers to reach higher elevation, often requiring the use of beds to climb up these inverted landscapes. I wonder if there could have been some way to use the frozen time as a mechanic to solving puzzles, like temporarily unfreezing an object to make it fall, opening up a pathway for us, sort of like a reverse stasis. But even then, this visual implementation is enough for me, as the other game's generic darkness didn't present an opportunity for any mechanic to be used. The final reason that I love the Still World so much is how it impacts the lore of Zelda. Where other timelines have had their depictions of alternate realities like the Dark World and Sacred Realms, none of them were temporal in nature, meaning that it's possible that the Still World is the remnant of one of the other timelines. With it being recently confirmed that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom is in its own timeline, it opens up the possibility of something strange going on with the timeline. Perhaps splits are happening somewhere other than Ocarina of Time, possibly even before Skyward Sword occurred. The Still World being a non-reality that came before existence with Null as its god implies that there are beings beyond even the goddesses and Demise who can destroy all of reality, and I would love a multiversal Zelda that involves Link going to destroy each of these omnipotent beings God of War style. But with time being such a core part of the great mysteries that surround Zelda, creating a being that wants to destroy time could imply that something is going to take effect on all four timelines in the future, but maybe I'm just getting ahead of myself. And Hyrule Warriors already did that, and that formula would never work in a traditional Zelda. The Still World is a morbidly fascinating concept, which is more sci-fi than anything Zelda has ever done, and easily outclasses the other inverted Hyrules, and I hope the tantalizing concepts it opens up are explored further. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video about why Echoes of Wisdom feels like a 3D Zelda.